All right, let's jump into this deep dive on the upcoming English local elections happening May 1st. I know, it's only February. And we've got the next general election on everyone's minds, but these local races, they're interesting in their own right. You've given us a ton of sources on them, so I'm really curious to see what we find.
Yeah. What's interesting is these elections are a bit unusual. Only 25 councils are actually up for grabs.
Oh, wow.
And on top of that was 7 county councils and then 2 unitary councils not even happening this year
Yeah.
because of these reorganizations they've got going on. Well, we're looking at a way smaller number of councilors being elected than we've seen in past years. Just 1,757 this time around compared to over 8,500 just last year.
Wow, that is a huge difference. So I guess what does that even mean for how we think about these results? Does it make them more important or harder to compare or...
It's kind of both, actually. Like, yeah, comparing them to other years is going to be tricky for sure. But with the smaller scale, each individual race could actually have a bigger impact on the overall picture. And then on top of that, where these elections are happening, adds another layer of, well, intrigue.
Right, because they're mostly in those rural areas where the conservatives have always been strong, right?
Exactly. It's their heartland, so these elections are a huge test for the Tories. Are they holding on, or are we starting to see some cracks? And how much of a threat is the Reform Party actually posing in these areas that have always been conservative?
Yeah, this is the first time we're really seeing that Tory versus Reform battle play out since the general election, isn't it? What do our sources say about what the Reform Party is doing, like their strategy and how likely they are to gain seats?
Well, it looks like they're really focusing on voters who are, let's say, dissatisfied with how things are going politically, especially people who feel like the conservatives haven't been tough enough on things like immigration and government spending.
Interesting. So they're really targeting a specific group of voters. Does that mean they might not have that big of an impact overall, or could they actually pull away enough votes from the Tories to really make a difference?
That's the big question, isn't it? It's definitely possible, especially if the conservatives are seen as having lost touch with their base. Some people think the Reform Party's appeal is limited to certain types of voters, but others think they could appeal to a much wider group, especially those who are just fed up with the whole party system.
So a lot of unknowns there. It'll be really interesting to see how their campaign goes and how voters respond. Now, where does Labor fit into all of this? They don't control many of the councils that are up for election, do they?
No, not at all. In fact, they only control one Doncaster. Now, that might seem like a bad thing, but it also means they don't have much to lose and potentially a lot to gain.
Okay, so they're starting from a lower point, but we've got all this historical data on how Labor has done in local elections. And one thing that really jumped out was that they've never actually gained more seats than they lost in local elections while they were also in charge nationally. Think that could change this time.
It's possible, but it would be a big deal if they did. You have to remember that governing nationally often means making tough choices that might not be popular locally.
Ah, so even if Labor is doing well overall, there might be local issues that hurt them in these specific elections.
Exactly. And then you've got the Reform Party on the rise, which could squeeze Labor between two increasingly polarized sides.
Sounds like it's a tough road for Labor to win these elections. They need to take advantage of any weaknesses the Tories have while also fending off the Reform Party and all the other smaller parties.
Yeah, it's a real balancing act. And then on top of that, you've got the mayoral races.
Oh, right. There are 6 of those happening along with the council elections, and Labor is defending 4 of them. What makes these mayoral races so hard to predict?
Well, one thing is that they changed the voting system to first past the post, which can really help the candidate who has the most support in one particular area, even if they don't get the most votes overall.
So even if a Labor candidate is popular, they could still lose if the vote is split between other candidates who are also kind of on the left side of things. And with this new Reform Party and existing parties like the Liberal Democrats and the Greens, that seems pretty likely.
Absolutely. And these mayoral races are often seen as a sign of the national mood, so the results could be important even beyond the cities where they're happening.
Hmm.
The move to first past the post just makes things even more complicated because it encourages people to vote strategically, meaning they might vote for someone they don't actually like that much just to stop someone they dislike even more from winning.
Wow, that makes things even harder to predict. So we've got fewer elections than usual, most of them in places where conservatives are strong, a new party trying to make gains, and a voting system that could really shake things up. Sounds like it's going to be interesting.
Definitely. And remember, these elections are just the beginning. They're a snapshot of how politics is changing in England, and they give us clues about what might happen in the next general election.
Okay, so we've set the stage. And it's clear these local elections are going to be really important. Now let's dig into the specifics. We've already talked about how Labor has struggled to gain seats when they're in power nationally. Why is that? And could anything be different this time around?
Well, one big reason is that voters often care about different things in local elections versus national elections. Locally, it's all about potholes, trash collection, schools. Nationally, it's the big stuff, the economy, healthcare, foreign policy. So even if a party's doing well nationally, they might struggle to connect with voters on those local concerns.
That makes sense. It's like people judge their local council on different things than the national government. So even if Labor is doing great in the national polls, that doesn't automatically mean they'll do well in these local races.
Exactly. And you also have to think about the history here. Labor has always been stronger in cities, and these elections are mostly in rural areas where they haven't done as well in the past.
So they've got their work cut out for them. It'll be fascinating to see if they can make any progress, especially with the Reform Party also trying to win over voters in those same areas.
For sure. And let's not forget about the Liberal Democrats. They're hoping to do well in these elections, too. They've always been strong locally,
Hmm.
and they could benefit if voters are unhappy with both the Conservatives and Labor.
It's shaping up to be a pretty exciting contest, that's for sure. Okay, before we move on, I want to bring up one more thing from our sources that I thought was interesting. The number of councils Labor controls right now is the highest it's been since 2002. That's a pretty big deal, especially with all the changes to local government over the years.
It really is. It shows how resilient they are and how they can adapt to the changing political scene.
But it also makes you wonder if they can keep this up. With the Reform Party gaining ground, the specific types of voters in these elections, and the possibility of votes being split in the mayoral races, it seems like it'll be tough for them to keep these gains, let alone win even more seats.
Absolutely. Keeping this level of success locally is a real challenge, especially with the political climate being what it is now. These elections are going to be a crucial test for Labor to see how strong they are and if they can connect with voters on those local issues.
Okay, so we've talked about the main players, the historical context, and what challenges and opportunities each party faces. Now let's dive into the data and see if we can uncover any more insights into how these elections might turn out.
Sounds good to me. Let's start by looking closer at this idea of projected national vote share that you mentioned earlier. It's a way to measure a party's overall performance, even in a smaller set of elections like this one.
Right, and we have all these figures showing how that share has changed over the last 10 years for each of the main parties. One thing I noticed is that Labor's projected national vote share in local elections is usually lower than their share in general elections. Why do you think that is?
Well, as we've talked about, local elections often come down to different things than national elections. People might be more willing to support smaller parties or independent candidates locally, especially if they feel those candidates understand their local community better.
In a general election where it's all about forming a national government, people are more likely to support one of the two main parties.
So it's not necessarily that Labor isn't popular overall. It's more about the specific way that local elections work.
Exactly. It's really important to remember that we can't just assume what's happening nationally will happen locally. These elections have their own special set of rules, and we need to think about that to really understand the results. Which brings us back to that word we've been using a lot, context. I know we've mentioned it a few times, but it's really important. These elections are happening in a very particular context, with a small number of councils involved, most of them in areas where the Conservatives are strong, and this new Reform Party trying to make a name for itself.
Absolutely. We can't draw any real conclusions without thinking about all these things. It's not just about who wins or loses on May 1st. It's about what those results tell us about the direction of British politics, how the parties are interacting with each other, and what voters are thinking.
So, as we look at the data and try to figure out what these election results mean, we need to remember all these special circumstances. It's less about making big, sweeping statements and more about looking for trends, patterns, and those little changes that might tell us about bigger political movements.
Exactly. Are the Tories losing ground where they've always been strong? Is the Reform Party making real progress? Is Labor taking advantage of all this? Or are other parties benefiting? These are the questions we need to be asking as we try to understand the results.
And it's not just about who wins and loses. It's about how much they win or lose by, how many people vote, how individual candidates do. Those details can often tell us more than just the big numbers.
Well said. It's about going beyond the surface and really digging into the data, the stories, and what's happening locally to really understand the forces that are shaping British politics.